Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Dallas Cowboys and their slow start to the offseason in the first segment. Now we are going to be moving on to our next, which is talking about some of the young quarterbacks in the NFL and talk about who has benefited most from the first few days of free agency. We still, of course, have the draft coming up, so there are chances for some of these teams to add additionally, but I did think that a few teams specifically did a solid job in these first couple days to try and help surround their potential franchise guys with some additional talent. The first of which, the biggest winner, I believe, out of the young quarterbacks is Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. They just gained the most from all positions. Yesterday, the news breaks that they signed Calvin Ridley to a massive 4-year deal worth $92 million. Ridley was the top wide receiver on the market this offseason, especially when you consider some of the free agency tags that were applied to Michael Pittman and T. Higgins. So Ridley was really the main target for a lot of these teams that were looking to add strength in the receiver room. And the Titans came at a little bit of a surprise. It had just been reported the day before that the Patriots and Jaguars were the finalists to get Ridley, but the Titans swoop in here and give the big offer. Now, there was a little bit of a connection if you look at how this possibly could have played out, where the Titans' new offensive coordinator, Nick Foles, he was the passing game coordinator with the Jaguars last season where Ridley was. So it seems like the two of them may have had a connection, that Foles seems to think that there's something he can really tap into here with Ridley. It seems like whatever connection they had ended up helping to get this deal done. Now, Ridley had a nice season in 2023. He had over 1,000 yards. He had 8 touchdowns. He was a bit inconsistent on a game-to-game basis. He had more games with 40 or less yards than he did with 100 yards. 9 games with 40 or less, just 4 with over 100. Now, 100 is definitely a big ask, especially for a player who was playing in a little bit of an inconsistent offense as it was anyways, especially once Trevor Lawrence went down with injury. But even before then, for whatever reason, the offense just was not able to function at the level that at least myself and I feel like other people expected them to coming into last season. But this is a nice addition for the Titans. They have a true number one wide receiver, which they have been missing ever since they traded A.J. Brown a couple off seasons ago. The receiving core as a whole should be pretty solid for next year in terms of the talent that's playing on the perimeter for Will Levis. I mean, it would be an incredible receiver room if this was 2020, having Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, but even still, should be a pretty solid group this upcoming year. It seemed like when Levis took over, DeAndre Hopkins was able to be more unlocked, of course, with that explosive first game, but now they can continue to build on that into next season. They do still have Treylon Burks as well, who is yet to make a real impact since being a first-round pick in 2022. The Titans were hoping that he could be the replacement for A.J. Brown. That has not taken place yet. He's been dealing with some injuries and just has not really made his mark yet on the NFL. But it does feel like there is still some level of talent that has just been untapped up to this point. They also yesterday re-signed their receiver Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, where he's nothing all too spectacular. He was an undrafted rookie when they brought him in, and he's been very solid for them the past couple years, but is just a good depth option for them, I believe, especially when you have, DeAndre Hopkins, who is older. You have Burks, who has injury concerns and hasn't really fully established himself yet either. And their tight end as well, it's a Okonkwo. I don't know how to pronounce his first name still. Chigoziem, I think it is. But a solid tight end option as well. Now, they also added a new center in free agency in Lloyd Cushenberry. He was with the Broncos last year. So they pay him some big money, bring him in to lead the offensive line, and they additionally add Tony Pollard, who I think we can all agree is a downgrade from Derrick Henry in terms of being a pure running back. But I am also intrigued in his ability to be an option out of the backfield for Will Levis. Now, I know that the efficiency last year was not good at all, but he still is able to be at least a factor in the receiving game. He topples over Derrick Henry in terms of targets and receptions over the course of the past few seasons, for whatever that means. I just think it could be an interesting addition there. And this is all for Levis, who there's still a lot of unproven with him. He was a second-round pick, 33rd overall in last season's draft. He is interesting where he had some first-round buzz going into the draft. A lot of people really dinged him for his senior season at Kentucky, where it was pretty underwhelming. He took a step back in terms of statistics and team success, but he is a mobile player, and he was dealing with some injuries, and he was on a Kentucky team his senior year that really wasn't all too talented. So I think it's more so when you look at Levis about what the highs potentially could be, and he showed some of those highs and flashes when he started taking over in week 8 for the Titans, where in his first game as a starter, he threw for 4 touchdowns. And again, like I mentioned, that's really when it seemed like DeAndre Hopkins was becoming unlocked, and Levis's season wasn't all pretty. There were some tough ones in there for him, but the flashes were there. He had a great comeback against the Dolphins in week 14. The primetime game he played against the Steelers ended in a game-sealing interception for him, but led a pretty solid drive where he almost put the Titans in position to win in his second start in primetime against one of the best defenses in the league last season in the Steelers. So ultimately, I think that there is talent there. Now, injuries derailed the latter part of his season. Again, a little bit of a recurring theme maybe from college as well. But ultimately, I think he has an improved offense around him, and we can learn more about whether or not he will be a franchise quarterback. Additionally, I think that another young guy from last year's draft, Bryce Young, does actually benefit from the moves the Panthers have made up to this point, where they went out and paid a couple of offensive linemen to try and help keep Young actually on his feet this year. They signed Robert Hunt from the Dolphins and Damian Lewis from the Seahawks to some lucrative multi-year deals. Both of these players' guards can be seen as a little bit of an overpay, but also at the same time, this is the state of the Panthers. They need to overspend a little bit to actually get themselves up off the ground as this rebuild sort of begins. I know that last year was a little bit of the start of the rebuild, but not even having your own pick in the first round hurts that for sure. But both Lewis and Hunt heading into their 5th seasons, coming off of their rookie deals. The Panthers are hoping that these can be key guys for them as they continue this rebuild. But Bryce was the second most sacked quarterback in the league last year, sacked 62 times, just behind Sam Howell for number 1. Addressing the offensive line was an absolute need for the Panthers this offseason, and ideally, you would want them to address the offensive tackle position maybe a little bit more. But you'll take what you can get for the Panthers, where I think a lot of the tackle options weren't necessarily the best this offseason, and there's a lot of age with them, a lot of injury concern, and ultimately, not that their guards that they brought in were elite players, but you also just hope that it is a step in the right direction for them. They are also hoping for Ika Mekwanu, their 6th overall pick in 2022. They're hoping that he can really emerge as a franchise building block, as a blindside tackle. He's been pretty average through the course of the first couple seasons. He was the first offensive lineman taken in his draft. They're hoping that he can develop a little bit more. Still plenty of time on his rookie deal to see if that is the case, but that would do wonders for Bryce Young if the blind side was able to be locked up. They also went out and they traded for wide receiver Deontay Johnson. This took place just yesterday, where the Panthers trade with the Steelers for Johnson. They move the 178th pick in the upcoming draft and cornerback Dante Jackson for Deontay Johnson and the 240th. So it's player for player and swapping picks. I think this was good value for both teams, where Deontay Johnson is going to be the best receiver on the team next season unless they work something else out during the course of this offseason. He's a fine player. I know that the past couple seasons have been disappointing. He was a Pro Bowler in 2021 and just hasn't given the same level of production since then. But I also amount at least some of that to the situation in Pittsburgh, where the offense was really struggling, really stagnant, and they just couldn't really get themselves together all too much. Now he gets a new start in Carolina, where, to be fair, still a lot of unknowns in Carolina as well, but at least Bryce Young, from his perspective, he has a guy. It was actually interesting. Deontay Johnson could have been a Kansas City Chief if the Panthers didn't come in and make this move. They were in talks with Pittsburgh about potentially making a move, so the Panthers actually steal him from the Chiefs. So if you are a Chiefs hater, you can call it that, maybe thank the Panthers for this one, if you think that Deontay Johnson can be an effective player, which I do. So the Panthers have a long ways away before being a contender, but this season is all about just making sure that Bryce Young is in position to succeed. Of course, everything they gave up around the draft last season to trade up and draft him number 1, they have a lot banking on this player, and their top priority is making sure that he can succeed. You move off of a talented cornerback in Jackson. I think that's a good addition for the Steelers in this one, to also get an improved draft pick as well with that. But ultimately, when you look at the Panthers situation here, it's really unfortunate that they don't have their own first round pick, because if they did, they would be in prime position to take on further draft picks, probably add a top tier weapon from this class. But the strength of the receiver class does extend to the second round, so there's still a good chance that the Panthers could find their way into getting a receiver. Then they have the number 33 pick and the number 39 pick that they got from the Giants. Final young quarterback that I think won was CJ Stroud. They upgraded in the run game with Joe Mixon. This was a trade that took place. The Bengals were planning on releasing him. They end up moving a 7th round pick to get him, which is nice because the Texans were at the bottom of the league in most rushing statistics last season. 23rd in total rush yards, 28th in yards per attempt, 23rd in rushing touchdowns. Devin Singletary was better in the second half of the season, but Joe Mixon is definitely an upgrade for them. They bring back Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, who is a nice player for them, was a pretty big red zone threat. I know it was only 5 touchdowns, but still just made things a lot easier for them. It's going to get Tank Dell ideally back from injury as well. I also really like the moves that they made on defense to sort of solidify that group, which could do a couple things. One, if you're looking at them as a true contender, some of the defensive lapses late in the game that forced CJ Stroud to bring on the heroics was an encouraging sign for him personally. But again, if you want to be taken as a more serious team, defense needs to lock up a little bit more in these late game stretches. They bring in Danielle Hunter, Azeez Al-Shaair, and Danico Autry. If you are a Jeff Okudah believer, he was also brought in as well, for whatever that means. But I liked the Texans offseason as well. I do have a couple names here. We don't really have time for it to fully dive in, but in case we had extra time, I did write down a couple quarterbacks that were not helped out, and that is Kenny Pickett and Justin Fields. Kenny Pickett with Russell Wilson coming into the room. He's going to be breathing right down his neck, looking for that starting opportunity, and that is very possible that takes place. We'll have to monitor that quarterback battle. And Justin Fields, who currently is stuck in Chicago with not much of a market for him elsewhere, going to be continuing to see how this all plays out as well. But that is all we have time for on this subject. We're going to be taking our second break, and when we come back, we will get into some NBA talk from last night's action. So stick with us, and we will be right back.